In 1930, French captain Alexandre Villaplane was taking his team to the first ever World Cup. He was leading his team and his country at the biggest event in world football. While his fine individual performances were not enough to prevent France from crashing out of the World Cup, Villaplane was able to hold his head high despite finding himself on the losing side. Fast forward a decade, and Villaplane was leading a new, wholly different team of men. He swapped his French jersey for the uniform of an SS Obersturmführer, and his French teammates for a ruthless brigade of thugs and mercenaries. But how does a man who was once a star of French football become a killer, torturer, and blackmailer for the occupying forces? And more importantly, what happens when Villaplane finds himself on the losing side once again? Alexandre Villaplane was born in Algiers, French Algeria in 1905. As a working class family, the Villaplane did not have much in the way of money, and as a result he received very little formal education. At age 16 he left Algeria for France's south coast, where he settled with his uncles. While Villaplane lacked in formal education, he more than made up for it with his footballing ability. He was first noticed by FC Sett's Scottish manager Victor Gibson, and began his footballing career at just 16. Villaplane quickly realised that football would provide him with opportunities that he would otherwise be unable to reach given his modest upbringing and lack of education. The lack of money in his childhood likely created a drive for Villaplane to look out for himself above all others, a theme which would become apparent in his career. And it was this outlook which would see him leave FC Sète at 18 after just a season and a half, when offered better terms by Vergès in the second division, a side financed by the mineral water company Perrier. However, just a season after joining Vergès, Sète realised the mistake they had made in letting Villaplane go. They quickly offered him better terms to return to the club, and it was at this time that international recognition came for Villaplane. In 1925 he was selected for a North African 11 to face France's B team, which caught the eye of national scouts. A year later he was called up to the French national team, quickly becoming an automatic choice in the starting 11. Villaplane's importance to the French national team becomes clear when you look at the team's results during his injury-plagued 1927 season. Without Villaplane in the squad, the French were demolished by Portugal 4-0, Spain 4-1, England 6-0, and Hungary a staggering 13-1. After returning from injury in 1928, Villaplane would go on to play in 20 successive international matches before his international career was brought to an abrupt halt in 1930 when he was just 24 years old. While no footage exists of him playing, reports from the time highlight his unmatched ball control, complemented by his physical strength and his aerial prowess. Villaplane's return to FC Sète in 1924 with more favourable terms showed him that by moving clubs he could often gain a better wage. At the time, French football remained amateur. However, it was widely accepted that top clubs would create fictitious jobs in order to attract the best talent. Villaplane was smart enough to realise that he could use this to fund a luxurious lifestyle by playing clubs off against each other. This resulted in a habit where he would change clubs every few years. He would leave Sète again in 1927 for SC Nîmes, before uprooting and leaving again to the Parisian Racing Club in 1929. Each move solely motivated by the promise of a better wage. The move to Racing Club was brought about by the club president's desire to replace Red Star as the top Parisian team, prompting him to spend fortunes on gathering the best players in the country. Villaplane, as one of the best, was naturally one of his first targets. Almost as soon as Villaplane entered Paris, he began to spend his lucrative wages in cabarets, casinos, fine restaurants, and at racecourses, some of the favourite hangouts of Paris's criminal underworld in the 1920s and 30s, a world the easily corruptible centre-half quickly slid into. As a recognisable footballer, Villaplane quickly gained a reputation. His notorious behaviour cost him his place on the national team, with the French Football Federation deeming it unsuitable behaviour for a national player, let alone the captain. This all came despite his stellar performances in the 1930 World Cup against Mexico, Argentina and Chile. The 1930 World Cup would turn out to be the last time he would represent France. By 1932, professionalism was sanctioned by the French authorities and Villaplane moved back down south to Antibes. Here he led Antibes to the top of the league, setting them up for the grand final which determined the league champion at the time. Word quickly spread that a crucial game against SC Fives had been fixed. While Antibes coach received a life ban, Villaplane, who had played a key part in the match fixing, received a slap on the wrist and a recommendation that he look for a different livelihood. He quickly moved on to OGC Nice, where his life and career unravelled for good. He showed up late for training and was thoroughly disinterested in the team which he had been made captain of. Nice would be relegated by the end of the season. 1 year later, Villaplane would earn his first conviction for fixing horse races, a jail term which would turn out to be the first of many. Not long after, war broke out, and Villaplane saw the biggest opportunity of his life. Germany's rapid occupation of France and the signing of the armistice in June 1940 resulted in an open season for France's underworld. Initially, Villaplane tried his hand at racketeering and blackmail, mainly targeting black marketeers and Jewish people, but was immediately arrested for handling hot goods. While in jail, Villaplane met Henri Lafont, a gangster who was to become one of the most hated figures of the occupation. Lafont was an opportunist who convinced the Germans that he could do business with them by assisting them in the destruction of a Belgian resistance network. In return for this favour, he was made head of the French Gestapo by the Nazis. Here, Lafont tortured and murdered his way to a fortune, alongside the disgraced former head of French police, Pierre Bonny. Initially, Villaplane was recruited to be Lafont's chauffeur before receiving his own big break in 1944. As the resistance to the Germans began to rise in power, the Germans created a North African brigade with the intention of cleaning up various elements of the resistance. Villaplane was appointed as the head of this brigade, a role which he took very seriously. When the Reich finally crumbled, Villaplane was quickly caught and tried, a trial which highlighted the extent of his crimes. According to the prosecutor, his psychology was entirely different from that of the other members of his group. He describes himself as a fiddler. I'd say he's more than that, a born crook, and to do their job, crooks need to have a natural feel for staging, and Villaplane has it to the highest degree. He would attempt and succeed in the most abject of blackmails, the blackmail of hope. Dressed in a German uniform, he'd get out of a car seized from the resistance and embark on the following monologue. What times are we living through? To what extremities am I reduced? I, a Frenchman, forced to wear the German uniform, these awful rags. They're going to kill you, but I'll save you, risking my life. I've saved 54 people, you'll be the 55th. That'll be 400,000 francs. If they had the money, the unfortunate victim would pay. Then, Villaplane would leave them to the mercy of his thugs, North African mercenaries whose savagery is remembered in southern France to this day. According to the survivors, Villaplane did not join in on the beatings, torture, or killings. Instead, he watched while counting his money. Except for one occasion. Once, when 11 resistance members did not have the money to pay for their survival, Villaplane joined in on their execution. The oldest of these resistance members was 26, the youngest of them was just 17. The prosecutor did not have to work hard to get the death sentence for Villaplane. He was executed alongside Lafont and Bonny by firing squad at Fort de Montrouge on the 26th of December in 1944. Villaplane the footballer died long before his execution in 1944, and when he died, so too did his memory, both due to the passing of time and the attempts at covering up the once French captain's horrible misdeeds. Descent into criminality was seemingly unstoppable following his move to Racing Club, but he descended to depths much lower than minor gangster, to traitor, and war criminal. It may be tempting to attempt to separate the footballer from the man who emerged in the war, blame the war for creating a monster wholly different from the man who had so proudly led his country at the World Cup. But to do so would be incorrect, and give far too much credit to a sadist, for whom the war was just an opportunity to act on the barbaric nature he had shown glimpses of throughout his life.